When I think about what inspired me to want to be a Formula One engineer, I really can't help but think about the early Red Bull championships and how dominant some of those cars were. And it's also impossible to talk about these championships without talking about Sebastian Vettel. I mean, some of those seasons were so dominant that he still holds a few of those records almost 10 years later. So now that Sebastian has left the sport, I thought it would be a great time to go back and reflect on his spectacular career. But not all of it was so spectacular. So instead of the usual technical analysis that I do on this channel, we're going to rewind a little bit and look through the last 15 years or so and talk about the highs and lows of Sebastian Vettel's career. What a ride. In 2006, Vettel started out as most young drivers do, by driving in a few practice sessions. But it wasn't until the 2007 US Grand Prix that Seb got his first chance to compete in an actual race event. The BMW Sauber team needed a driver after Robert Kubica was forced to sit out following his colossal crash at the previous Canadian Grand Prix. During the 2007 US Grand Prix, Seb managed to reach Q3, qualifying 9th, and even finishing the race in P8, which isn't bad that season considering Kubica tended to finish somewhere between P4 and P8. It soon became clear that Seb had earned the attention of at least one other team. 4 races later at the Hungarian Grand Prix, he signed with the Red Bull Junior team Toro Rosso, replacing American driver Scott Speed. Now, it is worth noting that in 2007, Red Bull Racing still had 2 different teams as they do today. You had the parent team Red Bull Racing. Their 2 cars were driven by Mark Webber and David Coulthard. You also had the junior team, Toro Rosso, or now called AlphaTauri, but at this point both teams were newcomers to the sport. It was some fizzy drinks company making race cars, neither of them yet with a win to their name, but only a few podiums. Now, during the rest of the season, Sebastian only scored points in China, finishing P4, which is arguably one of the most underrated drives of his career, being able to show maturity beyond his age to keep a cool head in soaking wet race conditions full of retirements. Now, despite Seb only competing a handful of races that season, he managed to outscore his teammate Liuzzi in the Drivers' Championship. Toro Rosso knew they were onto something with this guy. Being thrust into a Formula One seat as quickly and as young as Sebastian was at the time doesn't come without some errors along the way. He was off to a spectacular start, but it was far from perfect. The most notable mistake he made in his first year was at the 2007 Japanese Grand Prix at Fuji. Vettel was looking at a podium finish as he was running 3rd place behind the Red Bull of Mark Webber until disaster struck. The weather was absolutely atrocious with heavy rain and very poor visibility. While behind the safety car, Seb misjudged the gap between himself and Mark through the plumes of spray and manages to collide with Mark, ruining the chance of a podium for either of them. Now, this isn't a great start for Seb's relationship with Red Bull or Mark, but considering the track conditions and circumstance, I think Red Bull team boss Christian Horner was willing to let this one slide. And this was the first of many dramatic on-track instances between Seb and Mark, but we're going to have to wait and come back to those in a minute. While we're on the worst bits, 2008 started off looking very grim for the young German. Toro Rosso started the season with a revised version of their 2007 car known as the STR2B. Vettel retired from the first 4 races of the 2008 season, while his teammate Sebastian Bourdais didn't finish 3 of the first 4 races. Some of the retirements were down to mistakes, but a lot of it were down to the unreliable modified car. But in the 5th round of 2008 at the Italian Grand Prix, Toro Rosso introduced the new car, the STR3, and Seb's fortunes turned for the better. And I think this is where we started to see the absolute brilliance of Sebastian Vettel. He took the new updated chassis to pole position and won the wet race in one of the best underdog performances motorsport has ever seen. Conditions like these often give us a chance to let a driver shine through, and it really brings out the importance of the driver, their reactions, and their instincts. This weekend also marked the first of many records to come for the young German. At the time, Sebastian became the youngest ever race winner at 21 years and 73 days, only broken some 8 years later by Max Verstappen in Spain at 18 years and 228 days. Now, Seb still holds the record for youngest pole sitter at 21 years and 72 days, just ahead of Charles Leclerc and Fernando Alonso. Now, Monza wasn't his only great performance in 2008. With the exception of China, after the summer break, Seb would finish in the top 6 at every single race. And by the end of 2008, he would finish P8 ahead of both Red Bull drivers in the standings, and comprehensively obliterating his teammate Sebastian Bourdais, who scored just 4 points to Sebastian Vettel's 35 points. Now, here's something that a lot of people probably didn't even register. I had almost forgotten this myself. Red Bull's sister team Toro Rosso won a race before the parent team. I mean, this is the equivalent of AlphaTauri beating Red Bull, and it just doesn't seem like something that's reasonable. But at the time, Red Bull Racing and Toro Rosso were pretty much the same chassis. The only difference was that Toro Rosso had the superior Ferrari engine, whereas the Red Bull had this asthmatic donkey of a Renault in the back of the car. And this is where the story starts to get interesting. From 2010 to 2013, we saw something pretty amazing. Well, I thought it was amazing, but not everybody saw it this way. Let's set the stage. On one hand, you had Adrian Newey leading the design of the Red Bull, and on the other hand, you had Sebastian Vettel on his path to becoming one of the modern greats. Together, Red Bull and Sebastian dominated the next 4 seasons. Between 2010 and 2013, Red Bull Racing won 53% of the races. Red Bull Racing were well and truly in the mix, and they had to fight for those victories. So even though they won over half the races, Sebastian won 43% of the races in those seasons on his own. Love them or hate them, that was a good kind of dominance to me. But during this whole time, was Sebastian Vettel the hero or the villain of Formula 1? If he was the villain, it's hard to pinpoint exactly one thing. I think the bottom line is that people just hate to see the same person running away and winning races, sometimes seemingly unchallenged. We've seen it with Hamilton, and we've started to see it with Verstappen. If you do that enough, people are just going to get bored of you, and maybe that's not your fault. But on the other hand, Seb was not shy. He became pretty hated for his #1 gesture, which is just an extension of the first point in my opinion. But there were other instances where it was actually pretty difficult to like him. Now, is this attitude truly despicable, or is it just a characteristic of a champion most of us normal people just can't relate with? So let's talk about it. Now, the first time Sebastian collided with Webber back in 2007, it was an honest mistake, completely. You had a rookie driver in absolutely abysmal conditions, and you know what? It happens. Fast forward to 2010 and we're on race 7, the Turkish Grand Prix. Mark Webber was leading the Drivers' Championship after winning the previous 2 races of Spain and Monaco, but that winning streak and championship lead evaporated here in Turkey. As a result of spending most of his race following other cars, Sebastian had saved quite a bit of fuel so that he could have another lap of a more powerful engine mode, whereas Webber, having led most of the race, was not in such a fortunate position on his fuel strategy. He had to turn down the fuel in order to make it to the end. Now on lap 40, Sebastian, under pressure from the McLaren of Lewis Hamilton, goes up the inside of Webber. Webber holds his ground. As they near the apex, Sebastian tries to open up the corner a little bit so he can have a better exit, but he steers straight into Mark Webber. An absolutely abysmal day for the team. Now, Sebastian blamed Webber, and many people started to wonder, what about this Seb guy? Is it just that he can't lose? Or can he not see his mistakes? Is this the beginning of Sebastian Vettel's villain story? Now, before we get to the dominance and glory, we've got another seriously controversial weekend to talk about, the 2013 Malaysian Grand Prix. If you're not sure which weekend this was, have you ever heard of Multi 21? Well, if not, don't worry, I'll explain it. In a wet qualifying session, Sebastian qualified on pole in dominant fashion, putting 0.9 seconds into the second place Ferrari driver Felipe Massa. The race also started in the wet but eventually dried up, and Sebastian's teammate Mark has managed to take the lead of the race. At the final round of stops, Seb pits for the softer compound just a lap later than Mark. On the pit exit, Seb comes out alongside Mark, and they spent the better part of this lap side by side, getting what felt like excruciatingly close to colliding numerous times. Seb's race engineer Rocky told him on the radio, multi-map 2-1, look after your tires. This is pretty interesting because there is no multi-map 2-1. The multifunction rotary on the steering wheel actually only goes up to 12 or 14 depending on the wheel. This is just a coded message for don't overtake Mark. Even team boss Christian Horner came on the radio to tell Sebastian to hold position, but the order was ignored and he ended up overtaking Webber. And then he did what he did best. He had so much pace in hand that he opened up over a 6-second gap in 9 laps. On one hand, Sebastian definitely made clear that he wasn't so much a team player, but for what? Personally, I believe in winning on merit, and with that much pace in hand, are you really just going to sit back for what? I mean, that's not racing, that's a charity. Now, of course, the media and the fans had an absolute field day with this. Can you imagine what F1 Twitter would be like today if this happened? Holy. Now, I've got to say, incidents like this didn't make Seb a particularly likable character, but let's be honest, he was just so fast, and he knew it. A lot of people just got sick of him. But so far between 2010 and 2013, we've only really talked about the bad stuff, but what about the great, glorious moments of Sebastian Vettel? So let's talk about the 2013 Singapore Grand Prix. This will probably be remembered as one of Seb's most dominant performances. In qualifying 3, he had so much margin after his first run that he sat in the garage for the rest of the session so that he could save an extra set of new super soft tires for the race. Sebastian set a 142.841 while only Rosberg in the Mercedes managed to get into the 42s, so they lined up next to each other at the race start. Sebastian would only yield the lead of this race for a moment going to turn 1 on the race start. In a move of sheer desperation, Rosberg would send it up the inside, going wide. Seb simply went back underneath him and took the lead once more, and in typical Sebastian Vettel fashion, he sailed off into the distance. He built a 5-second gap to Rosberg in 3 laps. He eventually won the Grand Prix by a mammoth 32.6 seconds over the second place car of Fernando Alonso. Now, the scary part of that story, if it wasn't for a safety car for Daniel Ricciardo on lap 23, it would have been even more than that. But at this point, we've had 4 years of Seb dominance, and the fans had made up their mind. But like I said before, Vettel himself won over 40% of the races in this period. He's got 4 world championships while setting a number of records and delivering 4 constructors championships along with his teammate to the Red Bull Racing. Now, this is where the story gets interesting for both Sebastian Vettel and myself, actually. In 2014, I was a trackside performance engineer at Sahara Force India. My job was to work with Sergio Perez and his race engineer Giampiero Lambiase to get the most out of the car at the track every weekend. But Red Bull was the team that I always wanted to work for. I mean, they were what got me excited about engineering in the first place. I knew that there was more that I could learn at a front-running team. When I saw the job of trackside performance engineer advertised at Red Bull Racing, I knew that I had to apply. In my second interview for the team, my interviewer was none other than Sebastian Vettel himself. The job was actually to be his performance engineer at the track. And Seb made this really clear. Picking a team of people isn't exactly just about technical skills. It's very important that a team gets along, and you have to mesh with a group of people. That means race engineer, driver, and other people in the team. Seb was more interested in my motivation, how I communicate, and understanding will he and I get along at the track. Now, here's the supervillain himself talking about my feelings, what I'm passionate about, what motivates me. Yeah, big supervillain energy right here. Long story short, I was going to work with Sebastian Vettel and his race engineer Rocky in the 2015 season. But something just wasn't right at Red Bull Racing. 2014 was the first year of the V6 turbo hybrid power units, and Mercedes were dominating. Red Bull began to struggle. Daniel Ricciardo joined the Red Bull team alongside Sebastian and beat him in the Drivers' Championship this year quite reasonably. Now, it wasn't clear if it was the car, the engine, the team, or his new teammate, but Seb would announce his departure from Red Bull Racing during the weekend of the Japanese Grand Prix in order to replace Fernando Alonso at Ferrari. So no, I never got to work with Sebastian Vettel. In 2015 with the Scuderia, Seb would hit the ground running with a podium in his maiden race in Australia, finishing behind the once again dominant Mercedes duo of Lewis Hamilton and same machinery Nico Rosberg. The gearbox of the Mercedes was a familiar sight for Seb this entire season. Mercedes' development in the V6 hybrid power unit gave them an advantage locked in for years, quite literally. In 2015, the Mercedes duo would win every single race with the exception of 3. And Sebastian Vettel won those 3 races in the Ferrari. Sebastian also took the first non-Mercedes pole up to this point in the V6 turbo hybrid era in Singapore. I mean, he's pretty handy around that track. At the end of the season, he would finish nearly 100 points behind Lewis. Now, this wasn't exactly the Ferrari romance story that he'd hoped for, but to be fair, it was better than staying at Red Bull Racing and having to work with me, I guess. The Red Bull drivers, Daniel Kvyat and Daniel Ricciardo, finished 7th and 8th in the championship that year. So maybe leaving Red Bull wasn't that bad after all. Now, if going from 4 world championships in a row to only 3 wins in a single season sounds bad, the 2016 season is another low for Sebastian. Seb and Ferrari would have a win this season, falling from 2nd in the constructors to 3rd behind Red Bull Racing. Mercedes continued their absolute dominance. I told you that advantage was locked in for years. For the most part, it seems like the whole villain arc was completely forgotten. By 2016, Seb just seemed more annoyed than anything. Now, with their continued run of poor luck, we also saw a side of Seb that we didn't really get to see before. There was the famous Turn 1 China incident from the torpedo of Daniel Kvyat, who I was actually performance engineer for at the time. Now, I don't know if you've seen this torpedo, but go back and watch it again. Long story short, Seb has a lockup, he runs a little bit wide, and Kvyat's up the inside, completely hugging the apex all the way through. Seb ends up colliding with his teammate Raikkonen, but in the cool-down room after the race on the podium, Sebastian goes on a massive rant blaming Kvyat for this mistake. To be honest, Danny was pretty flawless and aggressive in that move. I just don't think Seb was used to having these kind of mistakes, and it looks like he just projected it at someone else. This was just strange and uncharacteristic of Seb, but we saw this a few more times in the next few years. Now, in Japan, we had the best blue flags compilation you've ever heard, as Sebastian was particularly annoyed at the back markers and traffic, just ranting most of the race. It was really starting to seem like the lack of success with Ferrari was turning into pure frustration, and Seb could not contain it anymore. Then, probably one of the most explosive of all of these moments was at the Mexican Grand Prix. In a late race incident, Verstappen would cut the track as Seb attempted to go up the inside into turn 1. Upon initially being told to give the position back, Verstappen would attempt to help his teammate Daniel Ricciardo through instead. Seb's response? Some pretty serious moving under the brakes to prevent this from happening. There was more swearing on the radio, and the post-race interviews from both Max and Sebastian were pretty nasty. Now, all this amounted to nothing, as they would both be penalized for unsportsmanlike action on track. With Daniel finishing P5 on track, he would be given the podium spot after the proceedings, making this whole drama completely meaningless. Now, honestly, I personally struggled to remember any of the high points in the Ferrari era Seb. But there were still some fantastic moments and a few opportunities missed, so let's talk about them. After an interesting first year and an absolutely dreadful second year at Ferrari, both 17 and 18 seasons had a lot of potential. But was it the car or the driver which kept them from these championships? The 2017 title challenge would start with a gentlemanly rivalry between Seb and the now clear #1 driver, Lewis Hamilton. They traded wins throughout the first few rounds, with the two being extremely evenly matched on pace. Seb would show some fantastic race management, using an overcut to take the lead in Australia, single-handedly beating both Mercedes to the flag of Bahrain, and then once again using an overcut to take the lead in Monaco from his teammate. The significance of the 2017 title fight was because it was the first time in the V6 turbo hybrid era that a team had actually managed to take the fight to Mercedes. The 2018 season would be much of the same earlier in the year, arguably with an even faster car relative to the field. The Ferrari SF71H took dramatic wins in both Bahrain and Silverstone, and who can forget the "Here comes Sebastian Vettel" line from Crofty in Belgium that year.
But here comes Sebastian Vettel!
He would finish P2 in both the 17 and 18 championships, comfortably beating his teammate Kimi Räikkönen in both, along with 5 impressive wins in each of those seasons. Both the 2017 and 2018 championships would come undone for Ferrari for varying degrees of responsibility for the team and the driver. First sign of a problem in the Ferrari camp was the notorious Baku safety car incident, in which Sebastian felt as though Lewis brake checked him under the safety car, where in reality Lewis never even touched the brakes. Seb ended up lashing out at Lewis, and the rest of 2017 was a relatively disappointing mixed bag. There was the Max Verstappen sandwich with his teammate at the start of the Singapore Grand Prix, and there's a pretty great tweet that goes along with this, but that's history. Now, this was followed by mechanical failures in Malaysia and Japan, to which Seb was completely a passenger. But mechanical failures would not be the reason behind the faltering of the 2018 campaign. There were 4 major mistakes throughout the 2018 season that can be directly attributed to Seb, and him struggling with the balance of the car while battling a rival or just less than favorable track conditions. These, in chronological order, were Germany, agonizingly crashing out of the lead as it started to rain after being easily the fastest car all weekend; Monza, clashing with Lewis on the opening lap after losing pole to his teammate, recovering to P6 while nursing damage to his car from the incident. The next big error would come at Japan, where he would go for an extremely ambitious dive on Max Verstappen into the spoon corner, spinning in a similar fashion that he did in Monza, finishing P6 one more. The last being at the US Grand Prix, in which contact with the other Red Bull driver, Daniel Ricciardo, would send him into a spin once more. Now, due to these isolated instances alone, he would end up losing 57 points in the Drivers' Championship to Lewis Hamilton. To blame Sebastian for losing the 2017 championship wouldn't really be fair, as most of the points were lost through mechanical failures or other racing incidents. But in 2018, I think it is the case. There were just too many driving mistakes for a serious championship challenge. Now, these mistakes would haunt him going into 2019 as well. Struggling to battle wheel with other drivers, dropping the car in a battle with Lewis Hamilton again at Bahrain, getting penalized for cutting the track in Canada, and then going into the back of Max Verstappen at Silverstone, and finally dropping the car in the Ascari chicane at Monza. But one thing to note during these years that I think says a whole lot about Sebastian's character is no matter what happened on circuit, Seb would always stand by his team. This showed an extreme amount of loyalty even when they were under massive scrutiny from the fans, media, and at times even other teams. And this, to me, really reflects on the kind of character that Sebastian was off circuit as well as on circuit. I mean, he was always constantly feeding his team motivation and always pushing for more. 2020 would be Sebastian Vettel's last year with the Scuderia. Sebastian's twilight years are not his most notable in Formula 1, but that doesn't mean that there weren't some highlights from these last few years. In 2021, Sebastian Vettel moved to Aston Martin. Now, despite being a midfield team, he did manage a single podium with the team. At the 2021 Azerbaijan Grand Prix, he made the most out of the race as none of the championship contenders were left to fight for the win. He ended up finishing P2 after putting some genuine pressure on the eventual race winner Sergio Perez on the safety car restart. And this was his last official podium in Formula 1. Now, I say official because he did challenge Esteban Ocon for the win in Hungary, again when the front-running teams were taken out of the race in the early stages. Despite a fantastic drive and almost winning the race, he finished P2 on track. Unfortunately, after the race, Sebastian Vettel was disqualified as his car could not provide the required fuel sample, which was a massive disappointment. I think for a lot of us, it was pretty frustrating to see Sebastian Vettel in the Aston. I mean, it was clear the drive and the passion was still there, and maybe he genuinely thought that with the new investment in the team and the money coming in, he could use his expertise and his experience in the sport and his very detailed feedback to help drive the team from the midfield towards the front, but this has not been the case. In his final season with Aston Martin, he finished P12 in the Drivers' Championship ahead of his teammate Lance Stroll in P15, while Aston Martin finished 7th in the Constructors. Now, this would not be a proper review of Sebastian Vettel's glorious career if we didn't go over some of the F1 records that he still holds to this day, so let's go through them. He's got the most pole positions in a season at 15. He's got 739 laps led in a season, which is also the record. He's got the most consecutive wins for 9, and he's got the most consecutive Grand Slams at 2. The record is shared with Albert Ascari in 1952 and Jim Clark in 1963. He's got the most wins from pole in a season at 9, which is a record shared with Nigel Mansell in 92. He is the youngest pole position winner at 21 years and 72 days. He's also the youngest driver to score a double pole and race win at the age of 21 years and 73 days. He is the youngest driver to score a triple. That's a pole, a fastest lap, and a race win at 21 years and 353 days. He's the youngest Formula 1 world champion at 23 years and 134 days. And finally, he's the youngest F1 runner-up at 22 years and 121 days. At the end of the 2022 season just passed, Sebastian Vettel announced he would be retiring at the end of the season. He stated that he had achieved everything that he wanted to in the sport, and it was time to focus on the next chapter in his life, including his family and the other passions that he has outside of the sport. During his 4 world championships, many saw him as a ruthless champion. But as time went on, we got to see a lot more about Seb as a person. Very few drivers on the grid are willing or compelled to use their platforms to spread awareness on topics that they believe strongly in. And despite lashing out in frustrating times, he was also kind and compassionate to those around him. He was very much human. He knew that he made mistakes and he was willing to own them. Despite being a relatively private person, without even using an Instagram account or anything until he announced his retirement, Seb somehow managed to share a lot more about himself with the fans compared to many of the other drivers that had a very strong social media presence. Sebastian Vettel leaves the sport with a legacy that will continue to inspire the next generation of drivers. His drive and enthusiasm for the sport will not be forgotten, and his presence will be greatly missed by fans around the world. I think I'm not the only one that hopes we see Sebastian Vettel back in the sport in some capacity in the near future.